Some of the smartest people you know stay stuck defending decisions that are clearly hurting them. Not because they can't see the consequences, not because they lack information, but because letting go would threaten something deeper than the decision itself. Once a choice crosses a certain psychological threshold, it stops being evaluated as an action. It becomes interpreted as a statement of identity. And from that point onward, the mind is no longer asking, "Is this still working?" It is asking something far more dangerous. What does walking away say about me? That shift, quiet, unnoticed, and almost universal, is where damage begins. Because when identity enters the picture, evidence becomes negotiable. Very few harmful decisions start as obviously harmful. They usually begin as reasonable, even admirable. A commitment, a belief, a long-term plan, a public stance, a personal promise. At the time, the decision feels aligned with values. It feels intentional. It feels earned. But over time, reality introduces friction. Results don't match expectations. Costs rise faster than benefits. Flexibility decreases. Options narrow. At this stage, the rational move would be reassessment. But reassessment rarely happens. Instead, the mind shifts from evaluation to defense. Not because the person is stubborn, not because they are unintelligent, but because backing out now would require admitting something painful. I misread this. I stayed longer than I should have. I tied my sense of self too tightly to this outcome. For many people, that admission feels worse than continuing to pay the cost. The most powerful force keeping people trapped in bad decisions is not fear of loss. It is fear of identity rupture. Once a decision is repeated, justified, or publicly owned, it begins to fuse with self-image. I'm the kind of person who follows through. I'm not someone who quits. I stand by my choices. These statements sound virtuous. They often are, until they aren't. When circumstances change, the same identity that once supported discipline starts blocking adaptation. The decision is no longer something you made. It becomes something you are. At that point, abandoning it doesn't feel like correction. It feels like betrayal of the self. And the mind will do almost anything to avoid that feeling. Once identity is involved, justification becomes automatic. Each new piece of negative feedback is reframed. It's just a phase. This resistance is expected. Others wouldn't understand. Time invested becomes evidence of correctness. Effort spent becomes proof of value. Pain endured becomes validation. This creates a dangerous loop. The longer the decision fails, the more justification is required. The more justification is required, the harder exit becomes. Modern psychology labels this escalation of commitment. Ancient frameworks describe the same pattern differently, as attachment narrowing perception, as ego mistaking persistence for wisdom. Different language, same human behavior. The mind is not trying to find the truth anymore. It is trying to protect continuity. One of the least discussed reasons people defend bad decisions is that consistency delivers emotional relief. Staying the course feels stable, predictable, coherent. It avoids the discomfort of uncertainty. It avoids social explanation. It avoids internal renegotiation. Changing direction forces a person to ask, who am I now? What was all that for? What does this say about my judgment? Those questions are destabilizing. So the mind chooses the easier reward, the quiet comfort of being consistent, even if that consistency is slowly draining resources, time, energy, or credibility. In this way, people don't stay because they believe the decision will succeed. They stay because leaving would feel worse in the short term. From the outside, the situation often looks obvious. The costs are visible. The pattern is clear. The alternatives exist. So advice flows freely. Cut your losses. Reevaluate. You're too attached. But advice fails because it targets the outcome, not the identity. The resistance isn't intellectual. It's existential. The decision is defending something deeper than results, a self-concept that cannot survive being wrong. Until that self-concept loosens, logic will always be experienced as threat. This is why people can hear correct advice, understand it, even repeat it, and still do nothing. Understanding is not the bottleneck. Identity is. Once a decision is witnessed, announced, or socially reinforced, its grip strengthens. Now, walking away doesn't just involve private discomfort. It involves perceived judgment. What will others think? How will this look? Will I seem unreliable? The mind exaggerates these risks. It imagines reputational collapse, when in reality, most people barely notice. But perception matters more than accuracy here. The self is already under strain. Additional exposure feels intolerable. So the decision becomes fortified, not because it is succeeding, but because too many psychological stakes are now attached to it. Across different civilizations and eras, the same observation appears again and again. Suffering does not begin with action. It begins when identity becomes attached to action. When a person can act without fusing the act to the self, adjustment remains possible. Correction remains accessible. Learning remains intact. But when action becomes ego, feedback turns into threat. Reality becomes negotiable, and defense replaces discernment. This insight was never about morality. It was about maintaining clarity under pressure. Defended decisions rarely fail catastrophically at first. They fail quietly. Opportunities decay. Optionality disappears. Flexibility erodes. Energy drains. By the time collapse is undeniable, the cost of exit is far higher than it ever needed to be. And the tragedy is not that the original decision was wrong. The tragedy is that the person could no longer see clearly, not because reality was hidden, but because identity stood in the way. People do not defend decisions because they are blind. They defend them because seeing clearly would force a reckoning between who they think they are and what the decision now reveals. Until that reckoning feels survivable, defense will always feel safer than change. And the cost will continue to accumulate, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily.